This is Matt Crockett. Welcome to Dallas for another cabin build. I suspect some of you came to see how I joined the containers together. So I'll show that first, and then I'll back up and show the rest of the build. This is just part one of the build, so I'll get this project as far as I can while still being able to separate and move the containers.
Got it.
Let's move up top and I'll show you how I joined the containers. This is just a larger version of a style of roof and deck that I built on the green container that I showed in a prior video. And it's just a slant roof covered by a rooftop deck. I take thick tube steel and weld it around the perimeter of the containers. This will be a 2x6 deck, and the deck frame will be attached to the top of that tube steel with the slant roof underneath it. A container is 8 feet wide, so two of them together is 16 feet. To span that distance, I take a 16-foot long 2x8 and cut it into a long, thin triangle. And this will give me a slant to put my roof on. These pieces of tube steel will be used to support the 16-foot long deck joists. I first connect the containers with a 4-inch strip of flat steel. And remember, this all needs to be undone to move these containers separately, so nothing is too permanently attached. Now I'll install an R-panel roof that sits on these triangles and runs towards the back of the container. And then once I complete this cabin at its final site, my plan is to build a tall pavilion that covers everything and gives me yet another layer of water protection and shade. Remember how there's some tube steel underneath this roof at about the halfway point of the containers? Here I'm just testing some support for the deck joists that sits on top of that tube steel. I'll add something more permanent later. So here's a look at the roof. I'll have 16-foot joists spanning the short way and then 20-foot deck boards running the length of the container, creating the deck. I want to cover that tube steel that sits on top of the container. So I welded that tube steel 1.5 inch back from the lip of the container. And here I'm taking some plate steel, which I'll attach later by screwing it or welding it to that tube steel. I'll cover the sides with that same 4-inch flat steel, which I'll weld and caulk in place and then paint later. So that's the plan for joining these containers. I'll now take you back to the beginning of this build. I bought these from a guy on Facebook who had used them for what he described as a white trash Topgolf. He had cut them up and used them as bays for people to sit in while they were playing. He was willing to deliver these, and I thought a double container with a lot of welding sounded like a pretty fun project. I knew this build would require a lot of metal work, so I wanted to build a full roof rack on my truck so that I could buy steel from the steel yard at the 20-foot lengths at which they sell it. I also wanted to improve my chop saw game.
This is the machine I've always used. And the problem with the machines that have the abrasive disc is that this disc, when you're cutting at a 45-degree angle, it has a tendency to bend and flex. And so it's very hard to get a good, true 45-degree cut. This one has a metal blade, and so the blade does not bend and flex. And from what I've seen, you get a much better cut, which makes it a lot easier to build good square and rectangular frames. I'm working on the door, or one of the doors right now. Got my basic frame that fits in the cutout. And all I'm gonna do is take more 2x2 square tubing and build a rectangle that fits perfectly inside of here. And that'll be the door.
The most enjoyable part of the build so far was building the doors, and in particular, one of the doors which has a little horizontal door within it. And I always like to build little things that can open and close. And my plan is once I get this situated, I'll put a little feeder outside of it. And then if the feral hogs come in the middle of the night, I'll have that little door open and I may be able to get myself some food. One thing with the windows that I may come to regret is besides this little piece in the door, I only have one window that opens and closes. All my other windows are fixed.
My thinking on the paint was that with all of the door and window frames, it would be cool to have a two-tone paint job with the container being white and the frames being black. And so I painted the container and the frames separately. The floor on these containers was in pretty rough shape. And what I decided to do was just to cover the existing floors with some moisture resistant subflooring. And then I'll cover those later
With something like a laminate flooring.
I got as far as I could, leaving the middle open, and I'll cover that with subflooring once the containers are moved. If you want to do a double container, keep in mind that there's some pretty thick steel near the ends of the container on the sides. And so you may end up with these little jog arounds like I have where the containers connect both on the sides and on the ceiling. So I'm not gonna have a flat wall, I'll have to sort of trim around it. And that's okay with me, but if you want something flat, you'll have to make some adjustments. And just a quick shot of my spray foam guys doing their thing. The only piece of the container that I don't do. One of the highlights so far was getting to put in all of the window glass. Although I'm definitely a little bit worried about the move.
Okay, here's where things stand now. This is the front of the cabin. And here is the back. The window on the right is the vinyl window that opens and closes. All the other windows are fixed. There's a door on each end. This thing's still not totally waterproof, and so I'll wait until it's moved to add the siding on the inside, and then any plumbing or electric will go on top of that.